Do you view this discursive war as continuing today up to this point in tandem with the military war?
Of course. One reason that the military war is so successful, one reason that we send F-35s and F-15s and F-16s and artillery ammunition and 2,000-pound bombs and so on and so forth, is because the Israeli narrative is central to the way the media and politicians see the world. I read the New York Times and I see a newspaper which is essentially seeing absolutely everything from an Israeli perspective. I mean, there are articles from Beirut, there are articles from elsewhere, but they're the way in which they see the world. This is true of, I would argue, mainstream TV stations. It's true of the entirety of the mainstream media, is from an Israeli perspective. How does this affect Israel? Today, Bret Stephens has a piece. We should do this. He's talking about we and Israel. It's like one. And I think that is a result of discursive victories over generations, such that among our politicians, almost without exception, among the mainstream corporate media, almost without exception, that perspective has become central. It's less effective with younger people because they don't pay attention to the mainstream corporate media. They see the world through different glasses, as it were.
That's an interesting way of explaining how the different generations view this conflict with completely different lenses.
Right. Well, that's new. I mean, I would argue that until the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was very, very rare for anything but an Israeli perspective to break into the mainstream media. And so you had a few dissidents, you had a few people who didn't see things that way, but they were a tiny minority. You never would see anybody in Congress opening their mouths, and if they did, they would lose the next election. Pete McCloskey, I could go through the half dozen members of Congress William Fulbright, who expressed some objections to this absolute adherence to the Israeli narrative, and were immediately, or very quickly, lost their seats. Today, you have dozens of members of Congress, a number of senators, several dozen members of the House of Representatives, who have expressed critical views on this. And that's a function of their listening to their constituents rather than listening to the din of the sort of Israeli perspective out of the mainstream media and out of most of the rest of our elites, to be very frank, in Western societies.